Welcome to Module 38, Classic Perspectives on Personality. And today we're going to look at the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic perspective of personality, which was popularized by Sigmund Freud. First, let's discuss what personality is quickly. Your personality really is the patterns of behaving, thinking, and feeling that are, relatively consistent across many different situations. So, we adjust our behavior according to situations, but with personality, we're talking about those characteristics that are, somewhat stable or pretty common across a lot of situations. So, for example, you might be an introvert, which means you're quiet and reserved, and you maybe spend a lot of time thinking about things. But, in certain situations, you can be outgoing and sociable. I've seen a lot of students who are strong introverts, but when they have to get up and give a speech in class, for example, they can do that very comfortably. They have no problems doing that. But across a lot of different situations, of course, an introvert would be more quiet and reserved compared to an extrovert. And that's how we think of personality. There's some flexibility in how we choose to behave, but there's also some consistent patterns in the way we behave, think, and feel. In terms of the way we think, you might consider that some people are kind of optimistic or some people are kind of pessimistic. That would be maybe one characteristic way that people think. And also with feeling, some people are kind of generally kind of sullen, and some people are generally kind of upbeat and happy. So these are all different ways all the different ways that you behave relatively consistently is what we call your personality. So we begin with the psychodynamic perspective, which is kind of a broader term that encompasses all the theories that place a strong emphasis on the role of the unconscious, but more specifically the psychoanalytic theory of Sigmund Freud. And you might recall from earlier in this semester that the psychoanalytic perspective or the psychodynamic perspective does place a strong emphasis on the role of the unconscious. That is a part of your mind that you're not consciously aware of. You don't have conscious access to the stuff that's in there. And Freud believed that it had a big effect on our behavior. So there were lots of different things that Freud envisioned being part of the unconscious. We learned earlier in this semester that some theorists believe that people repress memories of traumatic events, so they don't have to deal with the trauma and anxiety associated with those events. So Freud believed that repressed memories could be stored in the unconscious. And but he also talked a lot about instinctual type drives that we're all born with. One would be related to the aggressive drives that all people seem to have some degree of aggression, particularly if your life is threatened. You can be aggressive to protect yourself. And also, it was kind of like a life drive, which included your sex drive. Freud did emphasize sex a lot in his theory, probably more than he should have, but I think what he also meant by that was just, anything related to seeking pleasure, whether for some people that comes from eating food or, hobbies that give people pleasure. All those things would be part of that life drive, not just sex. So those were kind of some of the major things he viewed as part of the unconscious and things that could influence the way we behave, think, and feel. So I'm going to play a video now that kind of summarizes his perspective in that way, and it also addresses dreams and dream analysis a little bit. So this will be a little bit of review, but it's a short video, and I think it's good to see this and remember that we're viewing this from a historical perspective, a lot of Freud's theory is now considered outdated, but still important because he was a pioneer, and there were a lot of things in his theory that we still grasp today as being relevant to everyday life.
Freud too viewed the human brain in mechanical terms, somewhat like a steam engine. He saw the brain as a complex neural network in which neurons build up electrical charge and, as a result, require discharging. Freud envisioned that dreams occurred during discharge.
Freud comes at a period in the history of Europe where there has been this tremendous successful liberalism, this great industrial revolution, the apparent triumph of science and ideas, and at the same time, this increasingly powerful feeling that something is amiss, that things aren't working right, that aggression, violence, and hatred are still major issues.
I was standing in a garden. The snakes were...
Freud's work on dreams began in 1887 when he was seeing a number of young women who suffered from what was then called hysteria, a puzzling complex of symptoms that ranged from aches and twitches to complete paralysis. He grew to believe his patients' symptoms were elaborate defenses against the pain of long-forgotten psychic shocks. Freud treated them, unsuccessfully, with hypnosis. But when patients spontaneously began describing their dreams, he was intrigued. Eventually, Freud became convinced of the role that dreams could play in revealing hidden trauma.
He brought me a box.
What was in the box?
I was very much afraid to open it. But then
when Freud and a patient were working together to interpret a dream, he asked the patient what the patient could remember, which is called the manifest content of the dream. He then asked the patient to sort of associate to each of the elements of the dream, and that simply meant to say everything that came to mind in connection with both the dream as a whole and to each particular detail of the dream.
Freud's interpretation of the meaning of dreams was based on his larger view of human nature. He saw us as basically selfish animals driven by aggressive urges and the desire for pleasure. We learn how to repress our animal impulses as we grow up in order to get along in society, but we never totally conquer our primitive self.
So the end of that video is important because it emphasizes a major part of his theory, which was the structure of personality. And his idea that we had a lot of these unconscious urges and drives that influence us in early childhood. A lot of our behavior, in his perspective, was driven by those drives. As we get older, we develop a little more control over them, but they're always still there, kind of influencing us, maybe in subtle ways sometimes. So the structure of personality, he believed, was made up of three parts called the id, the ego, and the superego. And we use this analogy today that Freud did not use, but we kind of view this as kind of like an iceberg, where when you see an iceberg, you really are just seeing the tip of the iceberg above the water, but most of it's underwater. And that's kind of how Freud viewed personality, that most of our personality was influenced by factors in the unconscious, things that you were not aware of, like the part of the iceberg that's submerged. And a small part of our behavior was completely controlled by your conscious choices in decisions, and that would be the tip of the iceberg. So you can see that some parts of personality are submerged. The id is completely underwater, completely unconscious, and the ego and the superego are partly conscious and partly unconscious. So I'm going to go through each of those now and explain how he viewed those. The id is a part of personality that everyone is born with. And in Freud's perspective, the id is it's all unconscious. This is really the part of personality that houses all these instinctual drives and desires and wishes. And because some of those are not pleasant, we have a tendency to want to kind of hold those back in adulthood. But when you're a child, Freud believed that the id, because you're only born with the id, so children tend to be very impulsive and very demanding and very needy. And he viewed the id as operating according to the pleasure principle, which is kind of like the id wants immediate gratification and very impatient kind of part of personality. So if you consider, like, maybe you go to the cafeteria at Heartland to get some food because you're really hungry, and once you get down there, you discover you don't have any money. The id would be that part of your personality that's that thought pops into your head that maybe you could just shove some food in your mouth, or maybe you could stick some food in your pocket and just steal it. And that's kind of how the id operates. According to Freud, the id doesn't care about rules. It just wants its needs satisfied immediately. And it's driven by your hunger to be part of your hunger drive in the unconscious. So the id just wants your hunger to be satisfied. Doesn't really care about anything else. And you think about little children, that's kind of how they are, particularly babies. You know, they'll cry when they're hungry. They'll cry when they're uncomfortable, and they seem, you know, pretty demanding. And little kids are that way too. Little kids are pretty impulsive as well. You know, they'll run across the street to get their ball because if that's giving them pleasure, playing with their ball, and they lose their ball, they'll go after it, and they won't even think about anything else. That's all they want is that ball at that time. So by age 3 or 4, another part of personality called the ego develops, and the ego operates partly at a conscious level and partly at an unconscious level. And the ego's job is to meet the demands of the id, but it will try to do that in an appropriate way, so in a logical, rational way. So consider if the thought crosses your mind in the cafeteria that you could just steal the food, you probably also have a more conscious thought and realization that that's not the right thing to do, that there's got to be a better way to get food. So this is the part of your personality that is at a conscious level. This is the choices you're making, the way you think through situations to solve problems, and the choices you make to behave the way you want to behave. So Freud said the ego operates according to the reality principle, and that is to consider what's normal and appropriate in society and kind of adjusting our behavior to meet the demands of the id, but to do it in an appropriate way. Now, these defense mechanisms are operating at an unconscious level. And because the id has these sometimes inappropriate thoughts and wishes and desires and such, those can kind of, they're always trying to seep out to our conscious awareness. The ego's job is to protect conscious awareness from that, because we don't want to acknowledge maybe certain aggressive urges or sexual urges towards certain people. So if the ego can't keep those subdued, it will employ defense mechanisms. And there are a variety of defense mechanisms listed in the textbook. One of them, for example, is repression, which we've talked about before. So if you have a memory of an event that causes you a lot of anxiety, Freud believed that it was the ego that repressed those memories to keep those emotions away from conscious awareness, and then you wouldn't have to deal with the trauma. There are some matching items that you can complete in Blackboard to kind of quiz yourself over those defense mechanisms. The third part of personality develops a little bit later in childhood, and it's called the superego. And the superego is kind of the moral component of our behavior. It represents moral perfectionism. The problem with the superego, because it represents moral perfectionism, is that if your behavior were completely controlled by the superego, even when you did get food in the cafeteria when you're hungry, the superego would probably want to give that food away, because that would be the perfect thing to do, would be to help other people as much as possible. And that's good, but it's not great, because if you don't get food, then you're going to get sick. You're going to end up starving to death, right? So the ego is not only meeting the demands of the id, but the ego also has to meet the demands of the superego. And therefore, the ego requires a lot of that energy. Freud believed that a lot of psychological disorders occurred from this process. If the ego, for example, is overwhelmed and can't keep up with the demands of the id and the superego, then we start experiencing abnormal thoughts and behaviors. But you might notice in real life that sometimes you think about doing something, or sometimes you do actually do something and you feel guilty about it. Freud said that's because of your conscience. And that comes from your superego. Your superego operates with this conscience. Sometimes you'll hear people say about another person, well, it seems like that person doesn't even have a conscience. And usually what they're talking about with that person is that they do things for themselves. They don't seem to care about other people. They don't seem to mind taking advantage of other people. So remember that this is kind of an old historical perspective, but you can see how Freud viewed this in light of everyday behaviors. Now I am going to show another video, and this is called the marshmallow test. And in this video, I want you to think about how the children's behavior relates to the id and the ego. And the idea here is that the kids can have a marshmallow right away if they want, but if they wait a couple minutes, they can have 2 marshmallows. Well, obviously, think about what the id would be wanting to do, because it's impulsive and wants immediate gratification. But think about what the logical, rational ego would be trying to accomplish. And Freud said sometimes the ego will compromise with the id to kind of get by in some situations. So that's how I want you to view this video, even though this is kind of an outdated perspective.
Okay, sit in that chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have 2. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right. I'm gonna go do something and then I'll come back.
It smells yummy. It smells really good.
So it's up to you. You can have it now or you can wait. Okay? I'll be back. stay in the chair, okay? Okay.
Okay, so you could see from the video that those children were having a really hard time resisting the urge to eat that marshmallow. Kind of think of that from a Freudian perspective as the id just really wanting that marshmallow right at that time. Oops, sorry about that. And the ego, of course, really trying to resist. So he's saying, I want it now. The ego saying, wait, let's be smart about this. If we can wait a little bit longer, we'll get 2 of them. You'll notice sometimes the kids were smelling it or putting it near their mouth, but not quite eating it. And it's almost like the id almost won, and then the ego jumped in and kind of restrained it a little bit, kind of compromising with the id and letting it smell it or take a little tiny snibble. But anyway, I think that's funny to view from a Freudian perspective. Of course, nowadays we would view that very same behavior probably more from a biological perspective. And we would consider that the frontal lobe plays a big role in thinking about consequences and planning and impulsivity. And we know the frontal lobe is not well developed in early childhood. And that's why adults have an easier time controlling their impulses and thinking about consequences and such. So we view that a little bit differently today than Freud did. But you at least get an idea of how Freud saw those interacting parts of the personality. Sometimes in cartoons and even in movies, you'll see kind of a play on this where you see somebody has to make a decision. Perhaps you have to decide how much money to withdraw from your bank. And of course, the little devil there would be representative of the id, the impulsive, demanding part of your personality who would want you to take all the money out and spend it. The superego would represent be represented by the angel that appears over your shoulder and urges you to take a little bit of money out, and maybe you could donate it to the homeless. The ego here would be represented by your conscious thoughts. You have to decide how much to take out, and you have to kind of weigh that in light of the id and the superego's input. And the last thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that the ego sometimes needs some help to protect our conscious awareness from bad thoughts and such. And sometimes it will employ these defense mechanisms. I mentioned repression. There are 5 others. So you can review those in your book and then work on the matching practice items in Blackboard to see if you understand those and get some feedback on that. So there is an element here in defense mechanisms that I would say is pretty relatable to everyday life. Even though this is Freud's theory is old, certainly as you read over and learn about those defense mechanisms, you can probably think of times when you have used those. And in particular, I think Freud said rationalization was the most commonly used defense mechanism. And I mentioned that when we were talking about cognitive dissonance in the chapter on social psychology, where sometimes we justify or rationalize our behavior when we feel bad about what we're doing. And that's the same thing Freud was talking about. And I think another common one would be when people get angry at somebody and they take their anger out on something else. That would be another good example. So you can figure out which defense mechanism I'm talking about with that little example. But if you've ever punched a wall or thrown your pillow or punched your pillow or screamed in your pillow, certainly the pillow and the wall never did anything to you. You're probably using the pillow and the wall as a target to replace somebody or some person in your life that would probably cause you a lot more problems if you were to yell at them or hit them. So that's also probably a pretty common one. Well, I hope you enjoyed the coverage of Sigmund Freud. There's some stuff in the book about psychosexual stages of development, but remember, follow the study guide so you know what sections you need to study from the book and which ones you can skip, because we're not covering the psychosexual stages of development. Thank you. See you later.